Now, let's turn to the book of Daniel again. Appreciate the warm welcome that our brethren have given to everyone. And on my behalf, it's a privilege again for me to be able to open the scriptures to our hearts tonight. Let's read in the book of Daniel. And firstly, we'll read in chapter 4. And we're going to read verse number 17 again. Daniel 4 and verse number 17. And it says, "This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." Now turn back with me to chapter 3. That's our base text that we're taking. And then we read from Daniel chapter 3, verse number 1. "Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." Now we find that all fell down apart from certain men who were Jews. Look with me at verse number 9. The accusation is made. "They spake and said unto the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree." Verse number 12. "There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now, if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." Then was the Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these 3 men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and the other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, The flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Verse number 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth, and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth out of the midst of the fire, and the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was the hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. God bless to us again this very precious reading of the sacred scriptures. Now we've been moving through some of the practical chapters from the first section of the book of Daniel, and we've been considering this wonderful statement from chapter 4 and verse number 17. The Most High rules in the kingdoms of man. And we considered just a few nights ago, or possibly just over a week ago, Daniel chapter 1. And we saw that the Most High was the God that superintended and overruled the circumstances of his people's lives. Last night, we had the privilege of turning to Daniel chapter 2, and we saw that God was the God that communicates, and he overrules in that so that we might know the mind of God. Tonight, what we're going to take a look at is Daniel chapter 3, and we're going to see the God that cares. He's not a God that is distant, and he's not a God that is removed, but he's a God that cares in a very special way. He cared for Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. And I trust tonight that by the time our few minutes are done, and by the time we finish this ministry part of our gathering tonight, we will appreciate afresh that our God is the God. He still cares. Many are wondering just about circumstances that we are facing. Well, let me just assure our hearts tonight that God cares, and the Most High rules in the kingdoms of man. Now, as we move into chapter 3, just for sake of time tonight, the first thing I'll mention is this, that this is a delightful chapter. This is a chapter, it's beloved by all age groups. It's a chapter that inspires worship and provokes awe, and even children. I've listened to some of our brethren who can handle children and who work with children and in children's meetings. And I've been there when some of our brethren have read this chapter or told this story to children. And you can see children sitting forward, and you can watch as their eyes get bigger as they hear this story about the 3 Hebrew children who were put into the midst of this fiery furnace, and who came out of the fiery furnace and were preserved through the fiery furnace. And it's a story beloved by children. I would judge, beloved saints, this is a story beloved by all of us. We marvel at this, a delightful chapter that just provokes awe-inspiring worship as we consider that men were put into the midst of the fire, and God preserved them in the fire and brought them out of the fire. It's a delightful chapter. The second thing I'll mention, it's a distinct chapter. And it's a distinct chapter in many ways. For example, I'll mention certain things. You will notice that there's no date that is given in this chapter. If you were turning back to Daniel chapter 1, you'll notice there's a date that's given at the beginning of that chapter. And we noticed last night in Daniel chapter 2, there's a date that's given, and there's no date here. The amazing thing is that the dates of Daniel 1 and Daniel 2, they allow us to profile certain data about King Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, they allow us in some measure to analyze the life of Daniel and certain aspects of Daniel, how old he was, something of his background, something of the data about Daniel himself. Well, there's no date that is mentioned in this chapter. When did it happen? We're not exactly sure in that. Most likely, I would suggest that this happened early in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. You might wonder why I would suggest that. Well, I would suggest he's actually, maybe if we put it like this, he's testing the allegiance of his servants. And of course, there was a great image in Daniel 2. And Nebuchadnezzar in his dream saw that tremendous image. It was great, and it was bright, and it was shining, and it stood upright, and it was awe-inspiring. And Daniel told the king, "Thou art this head of gold." And of course, now in chapter 3, there's another great image, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. And we look at this image, all of gold, that's standing on the plain of Dura. And I would suggest to you that most likely, early in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, following on from his dream, he builds this image in Daniel 3. But there's no date that's given. That means that most likely again, Daniel's not mentioned in the chapter. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's no date. These young men, these Hebrew children that are called in this chapter Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were still likely quite young, most likely early 20s, when this event happened in Daniel 3. So there's no date in this distinct chapter. The second thing I'll mention is there's no direct prophecy in this chapter. And yet, the chapter's all about prophecy. Our brethren have frequently told us about the 3 6s that occur in the chapter. If you look at verse number 1 in the King James translation, it says 60 cubits, 60 cubits. There's the first 6. And then the breadth thereof, verse number 1, 6 cubits. And then you look down to verse number 5, and there's 6 musical instruments that are used: the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music. So verse number 1, 6. Verse number 1, 6. Verse number 5, it's stamped again, the number of man, 6. And so we've got it. 60, 6, 6, 6. We've got the image that is raised. I'm sure as I'm speaking to you tonight, you're going in your mind to the book of Revelation. And of course, the number of man, 666. And you know from the book of Revelation, there's going to be another day. And in the temple that is built, there's going to be an image raised. You know that it will be a time of trouble for the Jewish nation. You notice here in verse number 8, one of the charges brought against these men, they were accused because they were Jews. You look down at verse number 12, there are certain Jews. And so you can see there's actually a prophetical picture. There's no direct prophecy, but there's a prophetical picture which is being developed in the chapter. No date and no direct prophecy, and yet the chapter's full of prophecy. The other thing, and I've already alluded to this, there's no Daniel in the chapter. Some have wondered about that. Why is Daniel not mentioned in the chapter? Where was Daniel when these events unfolded? Well, we can only speculate about that. And of course, sometimes preachers like to do that. You ask some of the brethren that are online tonight, our brother Murray. I can't speak for our brother Murray. Maybe I better just speak for myself. But sometimes wonderful things in the Bible we see, many of them put there by you and by me. But we can only speculate as to why Daniel is not mentioned when it comes to the chapter. One practical thing I learned from that is this. that with the absence of Daniel, it just shows us that sometimes God preserves some of his saints from trials that he allows others to come into. Daniel wasn't brought into this trial. These men who are named as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in this chapter, they were allowed to go to the trial. But Daniel was preserved from this trial. And God allows and superintends some of his saints to be brought into aspects of trial that others are not brought into. That's one of the practical things that we learn from the chapter. A distinct chapter and a delightful chapter. It's a very detailed chapter. We're coming to these men, and of course you know the old line that has often been used. I'll likely finish on this note. When it comes to the chapter, we've often been told these were men that wouldn't bow. These were men that wouldn't bend. These were men that wouldn't budge. These were men that wouldn't burn. And so it's a very detailed chapter as we consider these men, Hebrew children, young men, and the trial that they faced as we consider Daniel 3. The first thing then, when it comes to the ministry itself, the first thing that I'll mention is from verses 1 and 2. And I want you to notice with me, we've got the prince's commandment. Actually, verse number 1 says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, he made an image of gold. The height of that image, it was 90 feet high. The breadth thereof, 6 cubits, 9 feet in breadth. And he set it up in the plain of Jura. And of course, he makes the decree that all of the princes and the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all the rulers, that they had to come to the dedication of the image and they had to bow before it. So we've got the prince's commandment in verses 1 and 2. You will notice that this is very similar to the situation that we are found in, even in 2020. You might be wondering, way back in Daniel's day, this is likely somewhere around just before, likely 600 AD, 600 BC, somewhere in that region, maybe even a few years before that, 600 BC, or round about that. And you're thinking, or I'm thinking, that the situation that these men found themselves in is similar to the situation that we find ourselves in. Well, consider this. It was a culture of idolatry. The symbol of man, it was raised on the plain of Jura. And everyone was told that they were to bow down to the symbol of man, the culture of idolatry. I would judge, beloved saints, that we are living in a culture of idolatry. Tell me, has self ever been on display in the way that it is on display when we find ourselves in 2020? We even speak about it, selfies. And you know the culture that is found around us. You know social media is just ablaze with this. All the celebrities and the celebrity following. And you think of the culture around us. And it's almost as if we are found just where these Hebrew men were found, as they are faced with the prince's commandment and the culture, the symbol of man that is being raised large. And it was the symbol of the culture of idolatry on the plain of Jura. The second thing I'll mention, not only have we got the culture of idolatry, you will notice it was a culture of intolerance. Everything went, and everything was a given, apart from that these men wanted to bow and worship their own God and worship the true God. There was a tolerance that was seen in this society, and yet there was an intolerance that was shown to these Hebrew men, these Jews. I think that you and I know that we are living in a very tolerant society, and yet the reality is this: it's a very intolerant society. I'm reminded of the Christian. She was at university, and she had an essay to write, and her professor, she was told that she could write about whatever she wanted in the essay that she had to present. And so she said to the professor, well, she said, I'm going to write an essay on the intolerance of tolerance. He said, what? Well, she said, look around us. We're living in a society and it proclaims tolerance. We can do whatever we want. We can live whatever way we want. We can worship whatever God we want. The tolerance that abounds, she said, what about me worshiping my God? And what about me proclaiming that there's only one God who is the true God? She said, I'm going to write about the intolerance of tolerance. And of course, you likely have guessed what she was told. She was told, you can't write about that subject. And it just proved the point conclusively. It was a very intolerant culture that these men found themselves in. And here we are, and we take a look around. The intolerance of tolerance all around us. It was a culture of idolatry. It was a culture of intolerance. It was a culture of intimidation. These men, they would feel the intimidation as they would seek to do what is right. Could I just encourage our hearts, dear believers tonight, do what is right. And as I'm speaking to you tonight, there is intolerance that abounds all around us. There is intolerance when it comes to the claims, the absolute claims of Holy Scripture. There is intolerance when it comes to the claims of what God has told us. Beloved saints tonight, do what is right and live for God. And these men would feel the intimidation as they would stand for God in a scene that rejected God, in a scene that said there is no absolute, in a scene that said you can't live for one God in this society. And we've got the Prince's commandment and the culture of idolatry and the culture of intolerance and the culture of intimidation. And you and I will find that this chapter and this book, the book of Daniel, is right up to date. The second thing I'll mention is not just the Prince's commandment. I want you to notice the present circumstances. These men were brought into trial. Now, a short time before this, they never ever anticipated that this trial would come. They never ever thought that these circumstances would mark their footsteps, and yet now they're in trial. I would judge tonight that none of us ever thought, just a few weeks ago, that we would be where we are tonight. I don't want you to forget now, but we read, the Most High, He rules in the kingdoms of man, and God is still in control, and yet these men are brought into trial, and various trials come in the life of God's people. You think of men of God, and they're brought into trials in life. I was thinking today about the man Job and the trials that he faced. I was thinking about Abraham and the trials that marked his life. You and I think about Elijah and the trial that he was brought into. We think about David and the trials that he faced. We think about Paul and the trials that marked his life. And now Daniel in the first 2 chapters of this book and the trials that mark Daniel's life. And here are these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the trials that they are brought into. Think about Job for a moment. You remember those messengers that came running to Job. And you remember the trial that Job faced. And the messengers come, and the first messenger arrived, and he says to Job, he says, the Chaldeans have come, and they've stolen away some of the herds. And the next messenger arrives, and he says to Job, the Sabaeans have risen. Then another messenger comes running, and eventually that messenger comes running to Job, and he said, Job, your 7 sons were together in a house, and your 3 daughters were there, and the 4 winds of heaven smote the house, and the house is fallen. And he said, all of your children are dead. And you remember what Job did? Job smote himself. And you remember what Job said? His wife would actually tell Job, curse God and die. And you remember what Job said? Naked came I into the world, and naked I will be removed thither. He trusted in God. He said, the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, Job sinned not. The trials that afflicted Job. You think of the man David. I was appreciating this today. I'll move over some of the rest of them. You think of David in Psalm 142. You remember what it says just in the headline of that psalm? It speaks about David, the prayer of David when he was in the cave. You know what I was enjoying, or at least appreciating? There are many of God's saints today, and they're just like David. And the walls are closing in around them. And it's almost as if the roof is coming down upon them. And they feel restricted. And they feel hemmed in. And they feel that they're in circumstances that they never envisaged. And they're in the cave, just like David. You think about the man Paul, and he's restricted now. There was once he moved freely in ministry for God. Maybe I'm speaking to someone tonight, and that's how you're feeling. Not just like Job, or not like David, and the walls are closing in, but you feel like Paul. And you remember Paul, he was in prison, in that hired house that we read about at the end of the book of Acts for 2 years. And he's chained to a Roman soldier from Caesar's elite Praetorian Guard. You remember he had evangelized all of the Eastern Mediterranean, touched by the gospel, all of those provinces. And he'd been able to move into those provinces with the name of Christ and the gospel of Christ. You know, beloved saints, and now he's restricted. One of the things, and I'm getting off topic, but I'm sure you'll allow me to do this. One of the things that's amazing me is just how the gospel is getting into homes tonight. We would think, well, there's a pandemic, and it has touched our world. It will restrict the gospel. You know, beloved saints, it's most likely that the gospel is getting into more homes tonight than it's ever got into before. And the medium that we are using, there are people sitting tonight and the gospel is being preached over in Corner Brook or from Corner Brook. The gospel is going forth. In parts of Ontario, the gospel is going forth. We'll begin, and our brethren in Clementsville will use this medium so that the gospel goes forth next week. You think of the man Paul, and he's restricted. And yet he will write in the book of Philippians, and he's just delighted because Christ is being preached. And he's just delighted that the name of Christ is abounding. He wants to touch the Western Mediterranean with the gospel. And yet there's this trial that is going on. And we've got the present circumstances here. It's not Job here, and it's not Elijah, and it's not Abraham, and it's not Daniel, and it's not David. It's these Hebrew children, and they're facing trial. And they never expected that this particular trial, it would come, but yet it has come. Maybe there's someone tonight, and you're facing trial. Maybe it's employment. Maybe it's family circumstances. Maybe it's just financial uncertainty. But there's trial that has come. You know, beloved saints, don't forget now, the Most High, he rules in the kingdoms of man. So we've got the Prince's commandment, and we've got the present circumstances. The third thing I want to speak to you about is the pressure to conform. There was huge pressure on these three men to conform. In fact, one of the things that I was appreciating from the chapter today, if you look down at verse number 3 through verse number 4, into verse number 7, right down to verse number 8, you can see the scene. The statue or the image, it has been erected. This huge statue. Most likely there was a base. And on top of that base, this image was erected 90 feet tall. The breadth, 9 feet wide in breadth. And of course, all of these men have been gathered. The list that we are given there, the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all of the rulers, they're all gathered together. And most likely, they were gathered in rank. So there would be the first rank before the statue or the image. Then there would be the second rank. And don't forget now that the position that these three men had would put them in the second rank in the kingdom of Babylon. So there's the first rank, the treasurers, the sheriffs, and all the rulers first in rank. Then there's the second rank. These Hebrew men were likely in the second rank. Then there was a third row that are found before the image. Then there's a fourth row, and there's a fifth row, and right to the common people that are all gathered for the dedication of the image. And of course, the music sounds. And the first row, they get down, and they bow, and they do obeisance. And as the music sounds, the second row, they start to get down, they bow, they start to do obeisance. So in front of these men, everyone is bowing. Beside these men, everyone is bowing. The three men are upright and they're standing. And the next row behind these men, they bow and they do their worship or their homage or their obeisance. And the next row, they bow. And the row behind them, they bow. And right in the plain of Jura, everyone is bowing before the image, apart from three men. There was pressure to conform. You know, beloved saints, there is still pressure to conform. These men, they must have taken a look around. And others were likely looking up at them. Everyone else is bowed, apart from three men that refused to bow, and they refused to bend before the image. Beloved saints, there is pressure for us to conform. In the world, there is pressure for us to conform to the social norm, pressure for us to conform to the cultural norm, pressure for us to conform to the political norm, pressure for us to conform to the religious norm that is found around us. And yet here are these men, and there was pressure to conform, but they wouldn't bow. That's the third thing we notice as we move into the chapter. So the prince's commandment, the present circumstances, the pressure to conform. You will notice, and this is a very pertinent point, there was the personal conviction that is found in the chapter. One of the things that we find in chapter 1 that largely comes to the fore is Daniel's convictions. And we move into chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, and it's Daniel's convictions. Well, wherever Daniel was, and we're not told where he was, these men now, they had to act on their own convictions. You know, here we are, and we are raising children in our homes. And it's a wonderful thing. Some of our children are saved in the homes that we represent tonight. Wonderful to raise children. Wonderful to see children brought into our world. Wonderful to teach those children the Word of God. Wonderful to give ministry to them from the Scriptures. Wonderful to see them develop in the things of God. Those things are just things that we value. But what we are looking for is this: personal conviction, that they will develop conviction. You know, these men couldn't hide behind Daniel's convictions. They might have wondered, what will Daniel do? In the pressure that is being brought to bear upon them, what will Daniel do? But the thing that's coming to our mind and to our attention tonight is this: that they had to develop their own convictions for themselves. One of the things I valued most was a thing that Mrs. Hull said to me. Our brother Albert Hull is gone to heaven quite a few years ago now. But I still remember we were at a day's meeting in Tatamagouche, Nova Scotia. And I was just walking down the aisle with Mrs. Hull after the ministry session of that day's meeting or conference. And Mrs. Hull said to me, she said, "John, one of the things that I have come to value is this, that you can't pass on your own convictions to your children. You teach your children the Word of God. You pray for your children, and you seek that your children will develop their own convictions from the Scriptures." You know, beloved saints, I hope that a chapter like this will show everyone that is joined tonight on this medium, and everyone that is watching, and some that are listening tonight. I hope that we will be able to develop our convictions from the Scriptures, personal convictions in our family lives, personal convictions in our assembly lives, personal convictions about our home lives, personal convictions about personal holiness and living for the Lord, personal convictions about our business lives. And here are these men, and personal convictions were developed. And I can see Shadrach, Look at Meshach, giving them their Babylonian names, which are named in this chapter. And I can see both of those men turn to Abednego, and convictions were developed that they would stand for God. So the personal convictions that are seen in the chapter. The next thing I want you to notice is the public confession that is found. In verse number 14, this accusation made against these three Jewish men. And of course, they're brought before Nebuchadnezzar. And verse number 13 speaks about Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and in his fury. He commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they were brought before the king. And in verse number 14, Nebuchadnezzar speaks to them, and he says, is it true? Is it true that you don't serve my gods? Is it true that you don't worship the golden image that I have set up? Is it true that you're not ready to bow when you hear the sound of the music? Is it true what you men have done? And in verse number 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they answered the king. And they said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful, or we have no need to answer thee in this matter. If so be our God is able to save us from the midst of this burning fiery furnace. But you will notice this, their public confession. They were prepared to stand for their convictions. I have a friend. His name is Joe Preston. And Joe told us a story one time. He was at a dinner in association with his work. And the CEO of the company that he was associated with stood up at the work dinner, and he began to tell an inappropriate joke to all that had gathered. And my friend Joe Preston stood up in the midst before all that were gathered, and he looked at the CEO of the company, and he said to him, he said, sir, I would like you to stop telling that joke. He said, I'm a Christian. And he said, the Bible says this, evil communication corrupts good manners. And the CEO looked at him, and to the amazement of all that were gathered, the CEO of the company said, I apologize. He said, I know Joe Preston. He's a Christian, and I apologize. That was an inappropriate joke to tell at a function like this. And there was a public confession, just like these men. And these men publicly witnessed to their faith in God. And these men publicly witnessed to the fact that God could deliver them. And they said to the king, the possibility is this, that the king might not, our God might not deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. There's no guarantee that we will be delivered, but we are absolutely sure that our God can deliver us from a burning fiery furnace. And they gave the public confession of their faith in God. Of course, you remember what Peter says. Peter says, be ready. Peter says, be ready to give an answer to any man with regard to the hope that is in you. Beloved saints, it's a wonderful thing, even at social distance, that we are able to be ready to give an answer. If anyone asks us, what about the pandemic? If anyone makes request of us, what about the circumstances? We are able to give an answer with reason to the hope that is in us. And we've got the public confession of these men as they would stand for God in verse number 14 and into verse number 16. We've got the prince's commandment, the present circumstances, the pressure to conform, the personal convictions, and the public confession, as these men would know the Most High, He rules in the kingdoms of man. What I want to move to and spend most of the rest of the time with is just verse number 21. I want you to think with me of the protecting care of God. These men were taken and they were bound, and some of the strongest soldiers of Nebuchadnezzar would bind these Jewish men, and they were brought. The furnace was heated 7 times more than it was normally heated. These men were brought to the mouth of the fiery furnace. These men were taken, cast You can see them being pushed into the fiery furnace. And the soldiers that brought them, these strong soldiers that brought them, such was the heat of the furnace that it devoured them. They were killed, they were slain through the heat of the furnace. And yet, these men that trusted in God, according to verse number 24, Nebuchadnezzar the king, keep that thought. As they say in Newfoundland, keep that thought and put it on the sticky side of your memory, because we'll come back to that in a moment. The protecting care of God. I want you to think with me of the fierceness of the trial. Here they are in the trial. Isn't it? It's a remarkable thing. God didn't protect them from the trial. God preserved them in the trial. And that's a much greater thing. There's some of our beloved saints tonight, and they haven't been protected from the trial. But you and I know they're being preserved in the midst of the trial. And you think of the fierceness of the trial, the furnace of fire, and it's heated 7 times more than it was normally heated. As I'm speaking to you tonight, I know beloved saints, and they've been in the fierceness of trial. I know young believers. And as I'm speaking to our hearts tonight, young believers have faced trial. 2 of them in particular that I'm thinking about tonight, they have faced trial that I have never faced. And the fierceness of that trial, a call came through one day, and when that call came through, they were faced with circumstances they never thought they'd ever be faced with. The fierceness of the trial and the protecting care of God. I want you to notice the next thing, not just the fierceness of the trial, the freedom of the trial. You know what this trial did? It burnt the only thing that Babylon gave them. You look at the story again. What was the only thing that Babylon gave them? It was the bonds. Those soldiers would take these men and they bound them. And when they were bound, they were cast into the midst of the trial and into the midst of the fire. And you think about them tonight, the fierceness of the trial and the freedom of the trial. And God allowed the trial so that the very thing that they were given by Babylon might be taken from them. You know, beloved saints, that's why God allows trials in our lives. The thing that tied them to Babylon, it was removed from them because of this trial. And the thing that ties us to this world, sometimes God allows trial. And when trial comes, it actually removes from us the thing that ties us to this world that we are living in. And God allows trial in its fierceness. And God allows trial because of its freedom. I want to speak about the most beautiful thing here, the protecting care of God and the fierceness of the trial. The protecting care of God and the freedom in the trial. You'll notice with me, the protecting care of God and the friend in the trial. Nebuchadnezzar takes a look into the midst of the burning fiery furnace, and he's astonished, and he rises up in haste, and he speaks to his counselors, and he says, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. And he answers and says, lo, I see 4 men, and they're loose, and they're walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now, most likely, the expression in the Aramaic language would literally be translated, the form of the 4th is like unto the Son of the gods. Most likely, that's what Nebuchadnezzar had in mind. I personally have no doubt that this was a Christophany. This was an appearance, pre-incarnation of the Lord Jesus. And I look at these words and I see Christ, the friend in the trial. The form of the 4th is like unto the Son of God. You know, beloved saints, There is a friend, and he's with us in the trial. You remember what he said to his own before he left them. And before he went back to glory, he looked at those 11 men that he gathered around him on the Mount of Olives. And he said to those men, "Lo, I am with you all the days." And we've got the protecting care of God. And we've got the fierceness of the trial. And we've got the freedom in the trial. And we see the friend in the trial, Christ himself, walking with these men. I actually mentioned, I was in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and I was doing some ministry. Actually, Daniel 1, Doug MacLeod, Scott MacLeod's father. The end of that ministry meeting, he pushed a little note into my hand, and I still have that little note. And when I went home, I checked it, and the little note said this: they walked with God in the king's palace, and God walked with them in the king's furnace. And they stood for God in the king's palace, and God stood with them in the king's furnace and in the king's fire, the friend in the trial. Let me speak to you about the finality of the trial. You know, God brought them out of the trial. I'm reminded of the words that are found in the book of 1 Corinthians. You remember what it says? To everyone going through trial tonight, never forget what it says. He will, in the trial, also make a way of escape. These men were brought out of the trial. And as they're brought out of the trial, they're brought into the presence of the king. You consider what it says. They come forth. They're brought out of the midst of the fire, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was there the hair of their heads singed, nor were their coats changed, nor was even the very smell of fire seen or smelt upon the man. And we've got the finality of the trial. Beloved saints, there's many in trial tonight, and there's many are facing trial. Elaine got a text this afternoon about a family, and their little girl was being rushed to the hospital today. Seems to be coronavirus symptoms. I think she's 9 years of age. There's many in trial tonight, and we need to pray for them. But there is the fierceness of the trial, and there is the freedom in the trial in this chapter. There's the friend in the trial, and the finality of the trial. These men were brought forth out of the trial because the Most High God rules in the kingdoms of man, the protecting care of God. I want to speak to you about the particular consecration of the man. I'll spend only a few minutes at this and then move to my last point. The particular consecration. In fact, it's Nebuchadnezzar that says it. Verse number 28, he says, these men, he speaks about their God, and he says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel, sent his messenger, delivered his servants that trusted in him. They have changed the king's word. And then he says this, they have yielded their bodies. Particular consecration. They yielded their bodies. This was years. You and I know Paul wrote about this. Romans chapter 12 and verse number 1. And Paul writes about consecration. And Paul speaks about yielding our bodies. And Paul speaks about everything being laid upon the altar. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Years, centuries before Paul ever spoke about presenting your body, these men presented their bodies. You know, beloved saints, what God wants from us? Presented bodies. Yield your members a living sacrifice. Take my life and let it be. Consecrate it, Lord, to thee. Take my fingers and let them flow. And, well, maybe hymnology isn't just flowing too well for me tonight, but I think you all know the hymn. And when I'm done tonight, You can go and check. I should have opened my hymn book and had it here before me. But you know, particular consecration and bodies that are yielded for God. The last thing I will mention, let me speak to you about promotion that is conferred upon these men. Verse number 30. Then the king, he promoted Shadrach, and he promoted Meshach, and he promoted Abednego, the province of Babylon. You know, Jim Elliot had it right. He is no fool that gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And these men ultimately were promoted for the stand they took in serving God. There is coming a day when we will receive the ultimate promotion. We will be taken from this world and we will be promoted to glory itself, into the next world. You remember what Paul says, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, it worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Beloved saints, tonight, these were men and they would trust in God. These were men that understood the Most High God, the Most High. He rules in the kingdoms of man. I've just come from Labrador. In Labrador for almost 6 weeks, I was staying with a beloved friend of mine, Ewart Lindstead. Some of those nights, Ewart would play some gospel music, particularly on the Saturday nights. Ewart would play some of those gospel tunes, put it up on the screen there in the family room, and we'd listen to some gospel music. There's a number of those. They became my favorite for those Saturday nights when we were together. I think my absolute favorite was The Fourth Man in the Fire. I think it was written by the Statler brothers. Many of you know that hymn. Many of you know that song. I won't quote it all, but the chorus of that lovely hymn goes like this. They wouldn't bend. They held on to the will of God, so we are told. They wouldn't bow. They would not bow the knee to the idol made of gold. They wouldn't burn. They were protected by the fourth man in the fire. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't burn. May the Lord help us tonight, beloved saints, that we are like these men in the midst of the circumstances, that we can trust God, that we won't bend, that we will not bow, and that we will not burn in the midst of the fiery trial that has come upon us. The Most High God, He rules in the kingdoms of man. Let's pray.